This is the second season of Unfuck the Poor, and we're just going to jump into it. The world is on fire and everything is terrible. Russia has started war with Ukraine, arguably a criminal offense no matter what language you speak. Now, there's a lot of information being thrown at us daily, from Russian and right-wing disinformation to paranoid theorizing about Ukraine's own reporting. We're even seeing, quote, evidence that maybe Ukraine really does need to be denazified, and that maybe Russia is justified in their invasion. They're not, and that's not what's going on. But that's what we're hearing. So who knows what's real and what's not anymore, and where do we even start? Hell, let's just start at the reality of the current state of global affairs, and what more fitting time to do so than the day after Joe Biden's State of the Union address. You know, the one that saw two Republican morons heckle the president like it was open mic night at Denny's. The truth is that Russia has invaded Ukraine. It has no justifiable or coherent reason for having done so. Ukrainian citizens are dying from shelling, cluster bombs, thermobaric missiles, and gunfighting in the streets. Russian troops, many of whom were unaware they were literally invading a nation that did not want, need, or dream of Russia's invasion, are also dying. They are being taken prisoner and, from what we can see, being treated well. Those who aren't being taken prisoner are being shot. What we have seen from the steady trickle of video by Ukrainian citizens on social media is a combination of corpses, explosions, refugees, and prisoners of war. It is important to note that in some instances we are seeing in real time Russian soldiers calling their parents to explain they have no idea why they are in Ukraine. But this level of detail is where disinformation comes into play. It is now common to see doubt sown about the validity of these videos, about them being propaganda or lies. I'll be covering all of that eventually, but right now I come directly back to the truth. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Ukrainian soldiers, volunteer fighters, and citizens, including children, are dying. Russian troops are dying. There is no justifiable or coherent reason for any of this to happen. If we are to agree on nothing else, if you wish to buy into disinformation, propaganda, and conspiracy theories, you cannot ignore or deny the refugees, the bodies, and the bombings. To ignore or doubt that is to do so willingly, blindly, and selfishly. Of course, to some, any credit given to the basic facts of the current crisis is to give credit to a world order they simply don't believe in, and I don't have time to debate reality. That's just bullshit. We're going to work our way backwards, from what is currently happening in Ukraine to how we got here. This is the polar opposite of how I would normally approach such a topic, but the immediacy of war in Ukraine demands it. So where are we today, March 2nd, 2022? Today, Russia claims to have captured the port city of Kherson in southern Ukraine, population approximately 250,000. It is the provincial capital of the Kherson Oblast, bordering what is now Russia-controlled Crimea. Crimea was annexed by Russia in 2014. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's advisor, Oleksiy Arestovich, denies Russia's claim that Kherson has been captured. Quote, "The city has not fallen. Our side continues to defend." End quote. However, Kherson's mayor, Igor Kolokhayev, has confirmed the absence of Ukrainian military forces in Kherson and that Russians have surrounded the city. According to Kolokhayev, overnight fighting has resulted in the deaths of 21 Ukrainians, and when Russian troops entered the city administration building, the mayor asked the troops to allow his citizens to collect the dead from the streets. Reports suggest Ukrainian forces have retreated northwest towards Mykolaiv, another port city nearly 70 kilometers away. Mykolaiv is a major transport hub and one of the largest shipbuilding cities on the Black Sea. It has a population of almost 500,000. The Russian assault in the south of Ukraine continues in the port city of Mariupol, some 420 kilometers to the east of Kherson on the Sea of Azov. Mariupol, which has been under heavy siege by Russian forces since the invasion late last week, has lost electricity and water supply as a result of Russia's attack. Mariupol is strategically important to Russia as it serves as a direct route to Donetsk, 113 kilometers to the north, which is one of two Ukrainian regions purportedly under control by pro-Russian separatists. The heavy shelling is expected to bring mass casualties, but it is too early to estimate the scale. Russia already controls the Azov Sea, having taken Crimea by force in 2014, and by linking the Crimean Peninsula to the Russian continent via a bridge built in May 2018 across the Kerch Strait. What is important, at least to Russia, is the symbolism of continuity, controlling the ports of Kherson to the west, Mariupol to the east, and all of the Crimean Peninsula puts Russia solely in control of the Sea of Azov. Russian naval authorities have announced that navigation into the Sea of Azov has been suspended due to Russia's anti-terrorist measures taking place in the waters there. As of today's report, 40 ships are waiting to enter the Sea of Azov, while over 170 ships are stranded across all of Russia's ports in the area. In northeast Ukraine, the city of Kharkiv has been under intense attack by Russian forces, with some news sources calling it, quote, the epicenter of fierce fighting, end quote. Just a day after failed peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, Russian paratroopers landed in Kharkiv amid widespread shelling, bombing, and urban fighting that has left little of Kharkiv untouched by artillery. This morning, a Russian airstrike targeted a flight school barracks housing Ukrainian troops. In Kyiv, Russian shelling targeting Kyiv's main television tower, killing 5, and struck nearby Babin Yar, a Holocaust memorial that honors the site where more than 33,000 Jews were executed by Nazis in 1941, and where mass executions continued until the liberation of Kyiv in 1943. Russia's war propaganda states, among other falsehoods, that the onslaught against Ukraine is to, quote, denazify it. President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish, born to Jewish parents. His grandfather served in the Soviet Army during World War II. The Soviet Army lost 8.6 million soldiers in the nearly 4-year war with Nazi Germany. Babin Yar is not just a monument, but a ravine in the earth that marks one of Europe's largest mass graves for Jewish civilians as well as Roma, communists, prisoners of war, hospital patients with disabilities, and Ukrainian nationalists. The future of Babin Yar hung in the balance prior to the Russian invasion. A massive $100 million project, including 12 museums across the area, had been finalized by the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, with support from the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky. As of today, Russia's defense ministry says 498 Russian troops have been killed in Ukraine and 1,597 troops have been wounded. The number of Ukrainian civilians killed in the first week of war has topped 2,000, with Russia's forces deliberately attacking civilian areas as reported by both the United Nations as well as from first-hand accounts by Ukrainians. The United Nations voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia's assault on Ukraine, with 141 nations voting in favor of the condemnation. Russia, Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, and Syria voted no, and 35 countries abstained from voting. The UN vote demands that Russia immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from Ukraine. Of those countries abstaining, many have long-standing ties or alliances with Russia, such as India, Nicaragua, and Cuba. If you've listened to Season 1 of the Unfuck the Poor podcast, you may have picked up on our deep-seated regret over the U.S.'s military involvement across the globe. The U.S. itself is responsible for literally millions of deaths around the world since the end of World War II, from Korean War, Vietnam, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, though the list is nearly endless, to the economic devastation that occurs whenever we export our American brand of democracy abroad. All U.S. presidents since the end of the Second World War have blood on their hands, from economic warfare that collapses nations' currencies and causes mass starvation, to military conflict, coups, and irreversible ecological damage. Within the past year alone, the United States has bombed Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. We are, with this podcast, staunch opponents of war and military intervention. But two things can be true at once. As the host of this podcast, I can easily stand in support of Andrei Kamenshikov, head of the Ukrainian chapter of Nonviolence International, who has said himself that his commitment to nonviolence extends to the present war in his home country. At the same time, I can stand in support of Ukrainians who do indeed wish to fight this war. Meanwhile, we can look at the conscription of able-bodied men aged 18 to 60 as both a horror and necessity. Though according to Kamenshikov, it is likely that there are enough citizens willing to volunteer that would make conscription unnecessary. It is the deep and personal ideology that one must grapple with when it comes to matters of life and death, family and country. Should the fighting in Ukraine end? Unequivocally, yes, of course. Should the Ukrainians capitulate to Russia in deference to strict pacifism? This is not up to anyone but the Ukrainians holding weapons, fighting for their home. We look at the war waging at present and our hearts break. We want peace, of course we do, for the Ukrainian citizens being slaughtered, and even for the Russian troops who have been sent into Ukraine, lied to, told they were sent there on a peacekeeping mission, or told they were still on exercises, as some reports on social media suggest. It should be apparent that neither side wants war. And now comes the finger pointing. Who is to blame for the current war in Ukraine? The United States? NATO? Russia? The overwhelming clarity that Putin has given as pretext for his invasion, specifically the discussion of NATO expansion eastward since the fall of the Berlin Wall, should not come as a surprise to anyone. It might not be rational, but it's not a surprise either. And in that sense, the tensions between the West, Ukraine, and Russia have been simmering since 1992, when Ukraine first joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council. Later, that became the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. That resulted in the opening of the Ukrainian embassy in Brussels, Belgium, where NATO is headquartered. In 1995, NATO provided logistical aid and drinking water after massive rains in Kharkiv led to flooding and the contamination of its water supply, the same water supply that Russia has cut off during the present-day war. At the time, water to 1.5 million people had to be shut off. Wells and rivers were polluted with over 100 million cubic feet of excrement, and that resulted in an outbreak of cholera. Shoddy Soviet engineering was blamed for this crisis, the same poor engineering that resulted in hundreds of deaths from an earthquake in Neftgorsk, and exacerbated the destruction at the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. Nearly a decade later, in June of 2004, Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma initially approved a provision in the military doctrine of Ukraine seeking admittance to NATO, though only a month later he said this was no longer Ukraine's goal, but rather to strengthen relations with NATO and the EU. A year later, 2005, after a recall election ordered by Ukraine's Supreme Court resulted in the, quote, free and fair election of Viktor Yushchenko over Viktor Yanukovych, talks of joining NATO progressed. Yushchenko is, to this day, an outspoken proponent of Ukraine's admission to NATO and received support from then-President George W. Bush. With every successive election in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government has been vocal about its desire to join NATO and formalize their integration into Western Europe in the interest of economic stability as well as national security. So what? What is the big fucking deal if Ukraine wants to join NATO, and who cares if the United States supports this move? So we're going to start off with the big lie, attempting to get off the ground in Western media. From the ultra-right-wing commentator Candace Owens, no less, though of course there are others. Owens has been quite vocal. Somehow she has managed to find time to be both an expert on vaccinations and infectious diseases, and now international treaties. She's been quite vocal that the U.S. is to blame for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, tweeting on February 22, 2022, quote, NATO, under direction from the United States, is violating previous agreements and expanding eastward, end quote. There has never been such an agreement, at least not one that was written and signed by any country at any time by anyone in power. And it is that second part that forms the basis of the extreme opposite argument, that there was never any discussion of NATO expansion between the U.S. and the former USSR. The Western backpedaling is even backed up by the relatively neutral think tank Brookings in a 2014 article circulating online titled, "Did NATO Promise Not to Enlarge? Gorbachev Says No." The truth lies somewhere between Candace Owens' wild misrepresentation of such an agreement and Brookings' stance that this was never discussed at all, because Gorbachev said so. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker told Gorbachev on February 9, 1990, and these are Baker's words, quote, "If we maintain a presence in Germany that is a part of NATO, there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction for forces of NATO 1 inch to the east," end quote. Baker has since clarified that such assurance was limited to Germany only, as it was only in the context of reunifying Germany. However, Jack Matlock, the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Robert Gates, deputy national security advisor at the time, have both asserted that the Soviets were led to believe such an assurance was being made, that there would be no NATO expansion not only within Germany, but to the east of Germany as well. In a 2009 interview with the German newspaper Bild, Gorbachev claimed exactly what has been widely reported. Quote, "We cannot blame anyone for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. However, many people in the West were secretly rubbing their hands and felt something like a flush of victory, including those who had promised us, we will not move 1 centimeter further east." End quote. 5 years later, in a 2014 interview in Russia Beyond with Maxim Korshunov, Gorbachev seems to have backtracked by saying that the question of NATO expansion never came up, not by a single Eastern European country. However, in this same interview, Gorbachev clarifies. He describes the resulting NATO expansion as, quote, "a violation of the spirit and the statements and assurances made to us in 1990, end quote. Gorbachev then clarifies and explains that Germany held up its end of the deal as ironclad, saying, quote, "Don't portray Gorbachev and the then Soviet authorities as naive people who were wrapped around the West's finger," end quote. Again, two things can be true at once. Those familiar with Western, or at least U.S. business relations, know that an agreement is only as good as the paper it's printed on. Whether or not you think that's underhanded, well, I guess that depends on where you were born. But anything spoken about but not signed is not part of a contract or even an international agreement. That Gorbachev notes this distinction himself should be a bright, waving flag to all that at the core of such international agreements is the environment in which it is cast. Diplomacy, to that end, should not be coercion through verbal appeasement. To Russia, Germany proved to be a true partner. As far as U.S. diplomacy goes, we have to wonder, would anything have turned out differently had we not opened our mouths about moving to the east in the first place? To have such a statement off the written record, not 1 inch to the east, but floating in the collective memories of those who lived through the moment, the journalists, politicians, diplomats, cabinet members, is to shroud the past in questions and the future in shadows. Is Putin paranoid, or does he simply remember the, quote, "spirit and the statements and assurances" made to the Soviet Union in 1990? While the rationale may be hollow, Putin did, after all, allow a NATO logistical base within Russia's interior to assist with the Allied operations in Afghanistan. Yeah, he did. It is something that Putin can cling to when it suits him. It is also something that can be pointed to it as either a misstep, a failure, or an act of deceit, depending on who wants to make the claim. Half Ukrainian, half Russian, Mikhail Gorbachev was born 91 years ago today, March 2nd, 1931. He is still alive. I will leave you with these final words from Mr. Gorbachev from the October 16, 2014 interview in Russia Beyond. Quote, "Please remember, in the second half of the 1980s, the USSR and the US took unprecedented steps together. They began reducing their nuclear arsenals. Just think of it, 80% of the nuclear potential that had been built up during the Cold War years was destroyed back then. Moreover, both sides conceded that nobody's security was compromised by this process. I am against all walls. I don't think our peoples will fall out. We're too close in all respects. There aren't any insurmountable problems or differences between us. But a lot will depend on the intelligentsia and the media. If they work to separate us, contrive to exacerbate our conflicts and quarrels, there will be trouble. The examples are well known, and so I urge the intelligentsia to act responsibly." End quote.